many of the in-depth pieces you did exposed social issues that needed covering, but you also, and editors always have, and long have, newspapers have, hold people accountable. And just in your last couple of years, there was the big story where the hospital was deep in the red, millions of dollars in the red, and without you folks reporting on that and pushing that issue, as you said in the book, the thought was that was something that really they were trying to cover up and not.
Yeah, it was probably one of the most discouraging times for me personally, because not only was the hospital was laying off people, they were closing outpatient services. This is important to the community. It's not just for the people in Glens Falls, Washington County, Northern Saratoga County, Warren County. People depend on the hospital a great deal. And they said, oh, well, we've lost 12 million. Well, the 12 million turned into, well, we found out by our reporting it had been 30 million. And then it turned out it was actually 38 million. And they had a billing system that didn't work. They didn't bill anybody properly for a year and a half. And to us, it was like, well, how do you not notice your revenues are down for a year and a half to the point where you lose $38 million? Somebody should be held accountable for that, because the services being lost in the community are affecting regular people and elderly people, people on Medicare and Medicaid. So that was an important story. And then the worst part about it all was then the hospital attacked us and said we were lying and said that we were making things up and just lied about everything. I remember going back and talking to Kathleen Moore, who was our main reporter, and she works for the Times Union now. And she said, well, they just lied about everything. And I couldn't trust them to tell the truth about anything. And that's just a really sad story. And, since I've left 2.5 years ago, there has not been another story about hospital finances. Did they make money last year? Did they lose money? I don't know.
And you talk in the book how it became quite contentious even within the paper, because the publisher, the new publisher at the time, sort of really put a stop to the coverage.
Yeah, well, he didn't put a stop to it, but he certainly put a crimp in it. And he started, being involved in some of the editing and things like that, questioning our reporters whether we were being too personal about it. And that was, when you have that kind of thing on the inside, that is really difficult. And at one point, Will Doolittle threatened to resign if the hospital coverage was going to be stopped. So those things can be really difficult. I understand publishers' role is to make sure that they're financially viable and they hit their numbers so that we all can keep our jobs. But this was something a little different, and it wasn't good. It wasn't a good way to go, and it certainly left a bad taste in my mouth.
You had talked through the years. You had a number of in the last few years. You had a number of publishers. For the most part, though, they kept their hands off and let you take care of the news.
I always said my greatest accomplishment was that I survived 6 different publishers, which is very hard to do. No, it is. I had good relationships and I had bad relationships, and it's a difficult job to be a publisher, and you have to balance the needs of here we are, we're telling the truth, and with if we tell the truth on this, we might lose a couple $100,000 in revenue from an advertiser pulling out their coverage, and that did happen. So that would eventually cost us reporters. And I think I had one publisher actually characterize it to me that way, saying, well, you can run this story, or you can, if you do run the story, you're going to lose 2 reporters. That's a tough position to put an editor in, so.
It is. And those are some of the tough positions, though, you were in through the years.
Well, absolutely, and
making tough decisions.
You were always trying to do the right thing. You were always trying to tell the truth, to be accurate, to be fair. A lot of the things we were accused later on of not being, but tried to be that every day.
Would you look at that hospital story and say that's one of the perfect examples of why you need community newspapers to be that watchdog?
Well, certainly, I think it's one of many and many, and even looking at things like we did an in-depth story at the beginning of the opioid crisis. Nobody had ever heard of OxyContin. Nobody knew that doctors were prescribing them like candy. We were right at the beginning of that when we did an in-depth story on that. We did a big in-depth story on underage drinking in the early 2000s. We had seen 8 teenagers die in alcohol-related accidents. And I was like, we have a problem. And I remember there was pushback from the staff, there was pushback from the community about us covering this issue, saying, no, it's just a rite of passage. And we started doing stories and telling the stories of these terrible tragedies, and the community responded. And they started doing things. They're trying to figure out how in these rural communities do we get our kids without them just having to resort to driving around town drinking. And I think we saved lives with that, those stories. Those are important type of things. So the hospital story was certainly part of that, but it was constantly. It was constant with catching politicians lying. It was with, trying to sneak things through, telling the things. You were always finding something else. And, there were just example after example after example. And the hospital was just one of many.
And speaking of politicians, contentious relationship with John Sweeney back in the day when he was the congressman, and then
he didn't like us, or maybe he thought we didn't like him.
But a number of stories that you reported that probably wouldn't have been out there if you hadn't been.
Well, and the Sweeney story is really interesting because back in 2001 he was involved in a car crash, coming back from skiing, ice skiing at Willard Mountain, car crash, state police there. They don't call and tell anyone in the media that a sitting congressman has been in a car crash right after he had just shut down the election in Dade County, Florida. He was being called Congressman Kickass by George W. Bush. He was a man in the news. This was a very high-profile guy. And so we later found out, we went and did reporting, and we went and talked to the bartender that night. Yeah, Sweeney had a couple glasses of wine. He didn't seem intoxicated, but, he wouldn't talk to us for years after that. And there were people who were calling us the liberal media, and you're just out to get a Republican politician, and you're just making all this stuff up and trying to, get him. Well, of course, you find out years later, 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, when he's running against Kirsten Gillibrand, well, the state police did cover up that accident, and they didn't issue tickets because they were told not to from someone at a high level of the state police. And then Sweeney has an interview with the Times-Union, and he says, well, at that time, I was really a functional alcoholic. So we were right going back as far as that, and that's the thing that, I say in the book, over time, newspapers tend to have gotten it right. They may be accused of getting it wrong, and I remember we took a lot of flack for that, but we got it right.
Newspapers have always had contentious relationships with politicians. No different for you folks in more recent years with Congresswoman Elise Stefanik.
Well, I'll disagree with the characterization. I think most politicians, we get along very good, especially on the local level. People, they're there to do good. They're regular folks for the most part. Those relations
the majority.
Tend to be very good.
There can be contentious
Obviously, congressional, it tends to be, that's the big leagues. There was certainly a contentious relationship with Mr. Sweeney, but we had good relationships with Chris Gibson and Kirsten Gillibrand and Scott Murphy. So the relationship with Stefanik was always weird because, it goes back to me, there was always kind of this, you didn't really know what she stood for. She was very robotic. She followed her talking point. She was smart, and she obviously had a lot of backing. But in 2018, the editorial board, we were seeing this really kind of what was going to look like a very ugly campaign with Tedra Cobb. Right after she won the primary, Tedra Cobb, they came out with this videotape of her saying that she couldn't come out in favor of banning assault rifles because she would lose the election. Well, that was taken undercover by a young 17-year-old man from down in the Capital District who had been paid $1,000. So she was condoning kind of political espionage by a teenager, which, that didn't think that was right. So in the wake of that, we said, let's just try something. Our editorial board got together and said, let's ask both candidates one thing: not to lie during the campaign, not to lie in their advertisements, not to lie on Facebook, not to lie on anything they say. Tedra Cobb came out, immediately agreed to it, wrote us a letter to the editors, said, absolutely. Never heard from Elise Stefanik. And, that just seems like a very standard thing, that how could a politician not agree to that? Well, yeah, sure, we all know they fudge the truth, they bend it, they twist it, but we were seeing something quite different, I think, in recent years, is that you're just seeing bald-faced lies, being told to the people, being told on Facebook, being told on, and, we really, I think that's one thing about reporters and editors in general. We really get, we're trying to hold them accountable to the reality, to facts. We're held accountable to facts. And when they're not there, or they lie to us, then we're going to fact check it. We're going to try to, make sure we get at the truth. And I think that has been a constant stream, unfortunately, with Elise Stefanik. She continues to kind of stretch the truth to beyond any reasonable means, and that's sad to see. And I think the reporters and editors need to be hold her accountable, and they can't, because there's not enough of them anymore. And I think she knows that. That's why she only goes on Facebook. It's why she doesn't do reports. Why she doesn't show up for debates. Those are important things that, she says she's for democracy, but she doesn't show up for a debate. That's part of democracy. So yeah, I think that there's good reasoning on our end to try to hold her accountable. So you can call it a contentious relationship, but I say we're just doing our job.
And speaking of politicians not being truthful, we now have the case of a New York congressman, George Santos.
Right.
And we have a weekly newspaper on Long Island, the North Shore Leader,
right,
that in September, before the election, was reporting a lot of the inconsistencies in his resume and his outright lies. And yet their readership's about 20,000 circulation, so a lot more people were voting in this election. But they were on the story and reported all of this going into the fall election, but he ended up being elected. Then the New York Times picked up the story in December, and it went national, and now, of course, George Santos is a household name. But there's a case where a local newspaper was doing its job and exposing what they said were mistruths. And
it's speculation on my part, but I wonder though if it's, when we would always look at the local weeklies. What do they have? Did they have something? Did they beat us on something? We would always check on that. And you wonder if somebody like Newsday out on Long Island, part of, we've got 7 or 8 congressional races they're dealing with. We're stretched really thin, and they just stopped doing that kind of stuff. And so it fell through the cracks, and it just didn't get up the chain of command that there was this real problem there. So that also could be part of, the local paper got it right, it didn't get the attention it deserved.
And this is the perfect example of where local journalism can make a difference.
Well, absolutely, and I think that it shows time and time again, where your local newspaper people, they know the players, they know the people involved, and they're one of the people. They're part of the community.
The point you make in your book is that this becomes a slippery slope. That if it's only news and information that we're getting from various sources, a lot of it online, off our devices, that we're not really aware of what's happening in our community, and that's the vital role that local newspapers have played for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just. People kind of took it for granted. They really did, and it was really, I'm sure that the complaint to compliment ratio was probably 9-to-1 for me as an editor on a regular basis, not because we weren't doing good work, but because, that's what gets people's attention, when they get angry about something. And that's okay too, to be angry about something, but I do think some of that was taken for granted over time, and I think that's the point I try to make too.